Think about the last time you opened your front door for a delivery driver.
Oh, yeah. It's almost an everyday thing now.
Right. You see that familiar logo on the van, maybe you nod at the uniform, and you just assume you and your family are perfectly safe.
Yeah, we don't even second guess it.
Exactly. It's this split-second transaction built entirely on blind trust. I mean, we willingly lower our guard because a corporate logo acts as a sort of a passkey to our private property.
Mm.
But in November of 2022, in a quiet Texas town, that blind trust was just utterly shattered.
It really was. We invite these massive, multi-billion-dollar logistics networks right up to our welcome mats, and we rarely question the complex and honestly kind of fragile legal and human mechanisms that actually get those packages to our doors.
Which brings us to the materials for this deep dive.
Yeah.
We're sorting through a pretty dense and emotionally heavy stack of sources today.
Yeah, it's a lot to get through.
It is. We're looking at local Texas news reports, some really heart-wrenching courtroom testimonies, wrongful death lawsuits, legislative documents. And then we're zooming way out with a comprehensive global newsletter that focuses on the state of capital punishment worldwide.
And our mission today is to sort of synthesize all of this for you. We are going to explore the really tragic murder of 7-year-old Athena Strand.
Yeah.
We need to unpack how this single devastating event exposed glaring vulnerabilities in gig economy corporate accountability. And from there, we'll look at the immediate legislative action it sparked.
Right.
And ultimately how this case plunges a grieving community right into the center of a highly complex, fiercely debated global conversation about the death penalty.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start on November 30, 2022 in Paradise, Texas.
Yeah, that's where it all begins.
Right. So a delivery driver named Tanner Horner arrives at the rural property of Jacob Strand. He is a contract driver for a company called Big Topspin, which is an independent service provider delivering packages for FedEx. And he's there to drop off a Christmas present. It's a box of You Can Be Anything Barbie dolls meant for 7-year-old Athena.
And the arrest affidavit details a timeline that just escalates from an accident into an absolute nightmare.
Yeah.
Horner was backing up his delivery van and accidentally hit Athena. But the crucial, agonizing detail here is that the initial impact did not seriously injure her.
Wow.
Yeah, she was alive, and she was entirely capable of communicating.
Wait, let me stop you there. Because I can understand, a moment of sheer panic after a traffic accident, especially for a commercial driver.
Sure, human nature.
Right. But how do we get from a bump in a driveway to an abduction and a murder? Like, what was his actual state of mind?
Well, according to his own confession, the pivot from panic to violence was driven entirely by self-preservation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Horner told investigators he was terrified she was going to tell her father about the accident. So, to silence her, he abducted her. He put her in the back of his delivery van, and a short time later, he strangled her to death.
It is just a horrific escalation.
Yeah.
And it brings us to the April 2026 trial, where Horner unexpectedly pleaded guilty to capital murder and aggravated kidnapping right before opening statements.
Which is pretty rare.
Yeah. And looking at the sources covering the trial, what really jumps out is the sheer physical disparity that the prosecutors emphasized. You have a 250-pound man against a 67-pound child.
It's sickening, and the emotional toll of the testimonies documented in these sources is just staggering. The prosecutor revealed that the very first words Horner said to Athena when he forced her into the truck were, "Don't scream or I'll hurt you."
Oh, my God.
Yeah. We also hear from her stepmother, Ashley Strand, who testified about the collateral psychological damage to the family.
Right, the sister.
Exactly. Her 14-year-old daughter is now absolutely terrified of delivery drivers. If she sees a delivery truck pull up to their house, she physically runs and hides.
And then you read the testimony from Athena's first-grade teacher, Lindsay Thompson. The Monday before Athena disappeared, her class had actually been working on a Red Ribbon Week activity focused on safety.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, Athena's final school journal entry was literally about stranger danger.
Wow.
That detail just twists your stomach. But it also highlights something really insidious. We teach our kids stranger danger, but the uniform bypasses that defense completely.
It really does.
It feels like the Trojan horse of modern convenience. We willingly invite uniformed strangers onto our property simply because they wear a trusted brand.
And that concept, that exact concept, is the absolute center of the massive wrongful death lawsuit filed by Athena's mother, Maitland Gandy. She is suing both FedEx and Big Topspin.
Okay.
The legal mechanism she's targeting is negligent hiring and supervision, and it strikes right at the heart of how these modern logistics networks operate.
So let me ask you this. Is a lawsuit like this just, an attempt to get a financial payout from a deep-pocketed corporation, or is it trying to expose a structural flaw in the gig economy?
I mean, based on the filings, the suit is fundamentally challenging the corporate liability shield itself. FedEx, like a lot of logistics giants, uses an independent service provider model. So they don't actually employ Tanner Horner, Big Topspin does. FedEx argues they are merely contracting with another business to handle that, the final mile of delivery.
So they're legally separate.
Right. But the lawsuit alleges that these billion-dollar corporations are insulating themselves by using these sort of fly-by-night contractors, effectively offloading all the risk while reaping all the benefits of the brand trust.
It's like they're building a legal firewall out of cardboard boxes.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, the branding makes it look like this fortress of accountability. But legally, the parent company is standing completely outside the blast zone. The lawsuit points out that Horner was armed with a FedEx uniform and a FedEx van, but the company allegedly failed to investigate his background or his mental health history.
Right. And the legal theory underpinning that argument revolves around two things: apparent agency and the duty of care.
Okay, unpack that.
Well, if a company rents out its highly trusted logo to a subcontractor, do they retain a legal responsibility for the safety of the public who interacts with that logo?
That's the big question.
Exactly. The plaintiff argues that by equipping a completely unvetted individual with the visual markers of a trusted brand, the corporation implicitly demands our trust and lowers our natural defenses. Therefore, they should be held liable when that trust is weaponized against us.
Wow. Let's shift gears slightly, because the systemic failures in this case weren't just limited to corporate logistics.
No, they weren't.
When Athena went missing, former Wise County Sheriff Lane Aiken initiated this massive, frantic search involving over 300 people. Yet, according to the records, it took nearly 24 hours to issue an Amber Alert.
Yeah.
24 hours for a missing child is an absolute eternity.
If we connect this to the bigger picture to understand why that happened, you really have to look at the strict statutory criteria governing the Amber Alert system at the time.
Little red tape.
Exactly. Law enforcement officers are handcuffed by federal and state guidelines. To issue a statewide alert, investigators have to provide definitive evidence that a strict kidnapping has occurred
Oh.
and that the child is in immediate physical danger.
So in those early chaotic hours, because they couldn't definitively prove someone took her, the state wouldn't issue the alert. Like, the local police essentially had to rule out the possibility that a 7-year-old just wandered off to the rural Texas woods before they could ask the public for help.
That is the exact bureaucratic bottleneck. It requires local sheriffs to spend these incredibly critical hours gathering evidence of an abduction rather than immediately mobilizing the public.
That's so frustrating.
And Maitland Gandy channeled her outrage over this delay directly into the Texas legislature. She gave this deeply emotional testimony, detailing how she begged for an Amber Alert from the moment she arrived at the property, only to be told her daughter's case didn't meet the rigid criteria.
And her testimony actually changed the law. It led to the unanimous passing of House Bill 35556, which created the Athena Alert. Mechanically, this allows local law enforcement to bypass that state-level verification delay. A chief law enforcement officer can now issue a regional alert covering a 100-mile radius and adjacent counties based simply on their own localized belief that an alert is warranted, even without hard proof of an abduction.
Right. It speeds up the process significantly.
I do want to push back on the practical application of this for a second, though.
Okay.
Because if we look at Tanner Horner's timeline, he escalated to murder incredibly fast in a state of irrational panic. Does a localized faster alert actually deter a crime of immediate violence like that? Or is this legislation really more about empowering a community's recovery efforts after the fact?
Well, that is a crucial distinction. An alert system, no matter how fast it is unlikely to stop an isolated panic killer in the first 5 to 10 minutes of a crime.
Right.
The real value of the Athena Alert is how it radically shifts the power dynamic during the critical window of an investigation. Think about it. In a missing child scenario, the perpetrator initially holds all the cards.
Right, the element of surprise.
Exactly. The control of information, the anonymity.
So you're essentially weaponizing the community's awareness to strip away that anonymity.
Precisely. By removing the bureaucratic red tape and pinging every single cell phone in a 100-mile radius, you mobilize hundreds of thousands of eyes instantly. You shrink the perpetrator's invisible bubble.
Wow.
Yeah, it transfers the power from the criminal back to the community during those first 24 hours, making it infinitely harder for the perpetrator to move, hide evidence, or escape the region.
And while the Texas legislature moves swiftly to change that alert system, the justice system itself moves slowly and with permanent, irreversible stakes.
Yes, it does.
Because Horner pleaded guilty right at the start of his trial, the entire proceeding shifted immediately to the punishment phase. The jury is no longer deciding his guilt, they're deciding his ultimate fate, which is life in prison without parole or the death penalty.
And this introduces the complex mechanics of a capital mitigation strategy. In the punishment phase, defense attorneys are actually legally obligated to present mitigating factors.
Which is evidence explaining why his life should be spared.
Right. And for Horner, his defense team is focusing heavily on his neurobiology and cognitive development.
Yeah, the sources mention they're citing a history of severe mental illness, an autism diagnosis, fetal alcohol exposure, and severe lead poisoning.
Mm-hmm.
I want to drill down into that last one. We hear lead poisoning and we think of a sick child, but how does that actually translate into a defense against a murder charge in adulthood?
It comes down to how environmental toxins alter brain chemistry over time. Lead actually mimics calcium in the body, which allows it to cross the blood-brain barrier.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and once it's there, it severely disrupts synaptic pruning and development, particularly in the prefrontal cortex.
And what does that part of the brain do?
That is the specific area responsible for impulse control, evaluating consequences, and regulating aggressive behavior. So the defense's argument isn't that lead poisoning excuses the crime, it's
Right.
that his brain is structurally incapable of the executive function we expect from a healthy adult.
It's like the justice system is asking a jury of regular people to balance an impossible moral scale. I mean, on one side, you have the visceral, undeniable horror of a 250-pound man abducting and murdering a 67-pound child.
Yeah.
And on the other side, you have the invisible, abstract chemistry of a damaged prefrontal cortex. How do you weigh visceral horror against abstract neurobiology?
It's an almost impossible task, but what's fascinating here is that this is the primary battleground of capital punishment today. The April 7th newsletter in our sources expands on this, showing how mitigation arguments play out nationally.
Oh, right.
Take the case of Corey Maples in Alabama. He was on death row for 25 years for a horrific 1996 murder, but he was recently resentenced to life in prison.
And the deciding factor in the Maples case wasn't necessarily new DNA evidence or anything like that, right? It was the quality of his legal representation.
Yes, exactly.
A mitigation specialist finally had the resources to uncover his history of severe poverty, child neglect, and heavy addiction starting at age 11. It exposes a terrifying mechanical flaw in the system. Like, whether you get life or death often depends entirely on the funding of your public defender.
The Maples case perfectly illustrates the crisis in indigent defense.
Yeah.
A standard underfunded public defender might get, 10 hours to do a basic background check?
If that.
Right. But a fully funded mitigation team will spend 1,000 hours digging through school records, psychiatric evaluations, generational trauma. If a defendant lacks the money for that robust defense, the jury only ever sees the monster who committed the crime, completely isolated from the damaged human being leading up to it.
And the newsletter also introduces this bizarre psychological phenomenon on death row, which is the duality of a prisoner. In Florida, you have Rafael Andres. He brutally beat and strangled a waitress to death with a rice cooker cord.
Just brutal.
But then, during his sentencing hearing, fellow death row inmates testified via Zoom to try and save his life. They called him a peacemaker with a beautiful spirit who broke up fights and protected vulnerable inmates.
It forces a jury to grapple with the paradoxical nature of human beings. A person can commit an unspeakable act of violence in one moment, yet exhibit profound empathy and humanity in a highly structured environment like a prison. And the law really struggles to quantify that.
And then you have the debate over mental illness itself. The sources highlight Omar Dean in California. His death sentence for killing his mother and a police chief was overturned due to juror bias. But the concurring justices went out of their way to explicitly point out Dean's severe schizophrenia.
Which is significant.
Yeah, it sparks a massive constitutional debate. Does executing someone who is entirely detached from reality violate the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment?
That debate over individual culpability is exactly why the death penalty remains so fiercely contested in local courtrooms. But the sources also force us to zoom out. When you move from individual trials to state and international levels, the mechanism of the death penalty transforms entirely.
I so.
Well, it ceases to be just about individual accountability and becomes the sweeping instrument of state power.
Now, as we zoom out to the global stage, we are stepping into a minefield of highly charged politics in these sources. And just to be very clear to you listening, our goal today isn't to take a side or endorse any of these policies.
It's absolutely not.
We are purely looking at how these source documents describe the death penalty being utilized as a tool by different governments.
Right.
We're strictly reporting the arguments as they appear in the text.
Right. With that context in mind, let's look at how capital punishment operates on a macro level. Even within the United States, it's a potent political lever. In Ohio, Attorney General Dave Yost is pushing aggressively to end the state's execution moratorium. His argument is rooted in retribution. He states that the government is failing victims' families and making a mockery of justice by not executing what he calls the worst of the worst killers.
But the sources also include the counter argument from groups like Ohioans to stop executions. And they aren't just arguing morality, right? They're pointing to systemic mechanical failures.
Yes.
They highlight that police and prosecutor misconduct, things like withholding Brady material or coercing false confessions, is actually a leading factor in Ohio's death row exonerations. Like it's present in 11 out of 12 cases.
That's a huge statistic.
Yeah, they argue you simply cannot trust the state with the ultimate punishment when the mechanism of conviction is demonstrably flawed.
And that tension between the desire for ultimate retribution and the reality of a flawed, sometimes corrupt system is echoed globally. The newsletter details a remarkable case in India.
Oh, this one was intense. Yeah.
A court sentenced 9 police officers to death for the brutal custodial torture and murder of a father and son. And they were arrested simply for keeping their mobile shop open past COVID lockdown hours.
And the prosecution called it a rarest of rare case. Usually we see the death penalty used by the state against civilians.
Right.
But here, the judicial system inverted that power, using the ultimate punishment specifically to penalize the ultimate abuse of state authority.
Moving to the geopolitical arena, the law itself is often scrutinized as a weapon of conflict. The sources detail a new law passed by the Israeli parliament that allows the death penalty specifically for Palestinians convicted of nationalistic killings.
Oh.
Proponents of the law argue it is a necessary deterrent and a long overdue measure of justice for victims of terrorism.
However, the sources also dedicate significant space to the massive international blowback from the United Nations and various human rights groups. How do those organizations critique the mechanics of this specific law?
Well, their criticism focuses on the creation of a two-tier justice system. They argue the law is fundamentally discriminatory because it effectively exempts Jewish citizens from the same mandatory sentences. Palestinian suspects in the occupied territories are tried in military courts, while Israeli citizens are tried in civilian courts.
I see.
So critics categorize this as an apartheid framework that removes judicial discretion and targets a specific ethnic group under the guise of national security.
And the sources round out the global picture by touching on the broader Middle East. In Iraq, 11 ISIS members were sentenced to death for plotting attacks on state institutions. And in Iran, the newsletter documents 13 political executions in just 18 days. The reporting specifically notes that the Iranian regime is using the cover of external war to rush these executions.
And that is a chilling example of geopolitical maneuvering. When the global media and international watchdogs are entirely focused on regional wars and military strikes, domestic regimes can use that smokescreen to rush executions of internal political dissidents.
Right.
They push them through sham tribunals, effectively silencing protests without facing the usual international sanctions.
So what does this all mean? When we pull back and look at this massive global picture, from Ohio's exoneration debates to India's corrupt cops to the military courts in Israel and the political smokescreens in Iran, does the death penalty cease to be about justice for individual victims like little Athena Strand?
It's a heavy question.
Does it simply become a megaphone for a government's political agenda?
I think that is the crucial synthesis of this material. When applied to an individual like Tanner Horner in a Texas courtroom, we are asking a jury to use the death penalty as an ultimate measure of moral accountability for a specific horrific act.
Yeah.
But when you scale that mechanism up to the national or state level, capital punishment becomes a mirror. It reflects a society's deepest fears, its internal conflicts, and its ultimate definition of power.
Wow.
Whether a government uses it to project strength, to suppress domestic dissent or to punish the abuse of authority, the mechanism of state-sanctioned death is rarely free from political utility.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today.
Yeah.
We started in a quiet driveway in Paradise, Texas, where a momentary lapse in our everyday trust ended in an unthinkable tragedy.
We did.
And we followed the legal trail into the corporate boardrooms of FedEx and Big Topspin, exploring the liability shields of the modern gig economy.
We examined how a mother's grief mobilized the Texas legislature to bypass bureaucratic bottlenecks and create the Athena Alert, really attempting to buy back precious hours for missing children.
Yeah.
And finally, we tracked how the ultimate punishment sought in that local courtroom echoes across highly charged, deeply political arenas all over the globe.
It really forces you to think about how interconnected the layers of our society are. A single package delivery isn't just a simple transaction. I mean, it involves a massive, invisible chain of corporate trust, complex legal liability, and profound human vulnerability.
And it reminds us that the systems we build, whether it's an Amber Alert update, a corporate contract, or a capital punishment statute, are ultimately flawed human attempts to manage the chaos and tragedy that can unexpectedly erupt in our daily lives.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with today. Society often talks about the justice system providing closure. We desperately seek it.
Yeah, we do.
We seek it through death penalty verdicts, through multi-million-dollar corporate lawsuits against delivery conglomerates, and through fast-acting legislation like the Athena Alert. But when you look at the sweeping, often politically weaponized global landscape of capital punishment, and then you look all the way back down to a first-grade teacher in Texas who still has to stare at an empty desk and read a journal entry about stranger danger, you have to ask yourself, does the justice system actually have the power to manufacture closure, or does it simply finalize the legal paperwork on our collective grief?